So welcome back to another microeconomics class. Thanks for being here. It's good to see everybody. Hope you had a nice weekend. Enjoy the beautiful weather while we can, right? We've got another snowmageddon coming, like 10 to 12 inches or something on Wednesday, so prepare thyselves. Real quick, before we jump into 10.4 oligopoly, I just want to talk about the differences between monopolistic competition and perfect competition. So your book and other books are constantly going to have you compare the outcomes to the perfectly competitive outcome, okay? So when it talks about efficiency, right? Talking about efficiency, it's essentially talking about comparing the perfectly competitive outcome, right? And so let's go back in time and talk real quick about that perfectly competitive situation, right? So we have our average total cost curve. We've got a marginal cost curve. And we've got some sort of flat demand curve that in the end ends up being exactly tangent to where the marginal cost and the average total cost, right? So it's this triple point right here. And this is our long run equilibrium, right? This curve that we have here in our perfectly competitive world is equal to our demand or our marginal revenue or our price. And so this is seen as the, kind of most socially optimal outcome, right? Why is this socially optimal? Because it is displaying what we would call productive efficiency. Which is that the goods and services produced are at the lowest possible average cost. Now, when we compare this to the monopolistically competitive world situation, remember, in the monopolistically competitive situation, now we have a downward sloping demand curve with a downward sloping marginal revenue curve that has twice of the slope. And then we still have our average total cost curve, and I'm going to draw it in a certain way. So we talked about the entry and exit behavior. Just like with perfect competition, there's entry and exit behavior in the monopolistic competitive world. And instead of coming to a final resting point here at the bottom of the ATC, it comes to a final resting point where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost. Once again, we drop our anchor there to find our Q star. Let's get rid of this stuff. It's confusing us. And then we don't go to the price right here. This price is completely irrelevant. It doesn't tell us anything, right? Because we're going to always go up to that demand curve, because why wouldn't we? That is what's telling us the revealed preferences of the consumers. At this amount of quantity, we're going to be charging this amount of price. And because of those entry and exit dynamics, if there's ever a time where you're making abnormally large economic profit, what's going to happen? There's no barriers to entry. People are going to enter. That's going to shift the demand around, right? So we talked about that at the end of class last time. It's also on YouTube if you want to take a look at it. It gets to the point where there's no more incentive for anybody to enter or exit this particular industry, right? They're making zero economic profits. But let's look at where they're making zero economic profits in terms of where it lies on the average total cost curve. Right? Is this productively efficient? Not quite, right? Because if it was productively efficient, it would be down here. So it's a higher, so our minimum average total cost is down below it. And so as a result, this monopolistically competitive outcome is not going to be as efficient, productively efficient, right? In terms of we're not going to be producing them at the lowest possible cost. So the firms are going to end up producing at a price on the downward sloping part of the average total cost curve and not necessarily on the lowest possible point in the average total cost curve. Does that make sense to everybody? So it's just where that long-term equilibrium sits and the fact that the price is going to be higher, right? If we were to say, well, what if this was a, like, again, that's part of why I made this graph over here, right? To show us that, this price right here, in a similar way, if this was a perfectly competitive world, this red line would be our demand curve and would also be our price. And so people would be paying a lower price than what they actually are paying given the market structure.
So just so I understand, the sacrifice is more money but higher average total cost. So they end up actually netting more money in the long run.
The firms are going to still, so in both cases, the firms are making zero economic profits in the long run. So in both cases, they're making that positive $150K accounting profit. That's your opportunity cost of your lost time and foregone interest and whatever you could be renting the building out for if you own the building or whatever the case may be, right? So they're both, in both situations in the long run, they're both actually making zero economic profits, which again is a good thing, even though it doesn't sound like a good thing. But the problem is that in both of the cases, the problem that is one of the cases, you have a lower price, right? In the perfectly competitive situation, right? For the same exact thing, it'll be something like, $10, and then this would be, $12. So we're charging consumers more, and so it's not as efficient in that way. We're not able to produce at a cheaper price, and so therefore we're not able to sell at a cheaper price, if that makes sense. So in both of the situations, you're gonna end up, and again, these are like theoretical constructs. It's tough to always fit real world examples into these things, right? But it has to do with what we're trying to kind of teach and learn is about the dynamics between the market and the individual firms. So it's about the fact that there's free information. People are able to see, oh, that person over there making all these quilts is, making a bunch of money. I'm going to start making quilts, right? And then there's relatively low barriers to entry in terms of, these quilt machines, they cost money or whatever the case may be. But once you get it, once you have the skill, you're able to do it, right? So there's not as much barriers to something like, say, starting a Google or a tech company or an AI chatbot or something like that, you know what I mean? Or starting a new university, right? I mean, like that's a high barrier to entry, But it's also not a very, very simple zero barriers to entry, like setting up a lemonade stand or, switching from planting wheat to planting corn or something like that, right? Again, depending on the climate, I know. Good question. That's a good question. But yeah, so in both cases, they're making zero economic profits. But in the monopolistic competition situation, the price is going to be higher. And so this, we're going to say, is not productively efficient. So the long-run equilibrium in the monopolistic competition world is not productively efficient, whereas the long-run outcome in the perfectly competitive world is productively efficient. Questions on that? Good discussion.